I stood there, frozen, the rain hammering against the window like fists pounding on my chest. It was late. Too late, really, when I found the note tucked inside her coat pocket. A simple piece of paper, folded once, with handwriting I didn't recognize. Meet me at the usual place. I can't stop thinking about you. My hands trembled as I read it, the ink blurring under the weight of my grip. My wife, Clara, my Clara, had been lying to me. For how long? The question clawed at my throat, but I swallowed it down. The house felt colder than it ever had, the silence screaming louder than any argument we'd ever shared. I'd always been the steady one, the man who kept his temper locked tight, but now something snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, staring at the note, letting the betrayal sink into my bones like ice water. She'd been at book club tonight, or so she'd said. A lie so flimsy I could have laughed, if my heart wasn't breaking. Then, the headlights flashed through the window. She was home. My pulse spiked, but my face stayed stone cold. I crumpled the note in my fist and slipped it into my pocket. She'd never know I'd found it. Not yet. The door creaked open, and there she was, her hair damp from the rain, her smile too bright, too fake. "Hey, love," she said, casual as ever. Love. The word hit me like a slap. I nodded, my lips tight, my eyes boring into hers. She didn't notice. Not then. But I did. I noticed everything. The way her coat smelled faintly of cologne that wasn't mine, the way her laugh sounded forced. And in that moment, I decided she'd pay. Not with tears or pleading. No, that was too weak. She'd pay with something colder, something crueler. Revenge was brewing in me, sharp and deliberate, and I'd make sure it cut deeper than she could ever imagine. The next morning, I woke before the sun, my mind already spinning like a spider weaving a web. Clara slept beside me, her breathing soft and steady, oblivious to the storm she'd unleashed. I watched her for a moment, her peaceful face, the curve of her cheek I used to trace with my fingers, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. She'd turned me into this, a man who could look at his wife and feel only the need to destroy her happiness. I slipped out of bed, silent as a shadow, and made coffee. The routine was my disguise. When she came downstairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes, I handed her a mug and smiled. "Good morning," I said, my voice smooth, practiced. She smiled back, unsuspecting, and thanked me. It was almost too easy. She had no idea I'd spent the night awake, plotting, piecing together every lie she'd fed me over months, maybe years. Book club, late shifts, that weekend retreat with her friends. How had I been so blind? I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation was messy, emotional, beneath me now. Instead, I asked, "Got plans today?" Casual, curious, like the husband I'd always been. She hesitated, just a flicker, before saying, "Oh, just lunch with Sarah." Sarah, another name to add to my list. I nodded, sipping my coffee, letting her think she'd won. But inside, I was carving out the first step of my plan. I'd follow her. I'd see this lunch for myself. As she left the house, humming some tune I didn't recognize, I felt the coldness settle deeper. This wasn't impulsive anger. This was calculated. She'd betrayed me, and I'd make her regret it. Not with fists or shouts, but with something far worse. I grabbed my keys and headed for the car. The game had begun. The streets were slick with last night's rain, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror of my mood. I kept my distance, 2 cars behind Clara's little blue sedan, my hands tied on the wheel. She drove with that carefree ease I used to love. Now it just made my stomach twist. Lunch with Sarah, she'd said. I'd have believed it once, but not today. Not after that note burned a hole in my pocket. She didn't head toward the cafe district. No, she turned down a quiet road, one lined with old oaks and houses too big for their own good. My pulse quickened. Where was she going? I followed, careful not to get too close, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Sarah lived out here. Maybe it was innocent. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was a blade, and I was about to let it cut me open. She pulled into a driveway, a modern house with too many windows, and I parked a block away, watching. A man stepped out to greet her. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin I wanted to wipe off his face. Not Sarah. Definitely not Sarah. Clara leapt out of the car and threw her arms around him, laughing like she hadn't laughed with me in years. My chest tightened. Anger, Yes, but something else too. Loss. A piece of me died right there, watching her with him. I didn't storm over. I didn't honk or scream. I sat there, silent, letting the scene sear itself into my memory. Every detail, his hand on her back, the way she tilted her head, fuel for what was coming. Revenge wasn't loud, it was patient. I snapped a photo with my phone, blurry but clear enough. Evidence. Step 1 complete. As I drove away, the coldness in me hardened into something unbreakable. She'd feel this soon. Oh, she'd feel it. I drove home with the precision of a man who'd just been handed a death sentence and decided to write his own ending. The photo sat heavy in my phone, a silent witness to Clara's betrayal, glowing faintly every time I glanced at the screen. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, but my mind was a storm held in check, lightning flashing behind a wall of ice. I didn't weep. I didn't curse her name. I planned. Revenge wasn't a burst of rage. It was a slow, deliberate carving, and I was sharpening the knife. The house was too quiet when I stepped inside. Her absence echoed in the empty halls, mocking me with memories of a life I'd thought was ours. The kitchen still smelled of morning coffee. Her coffee, the mug I'd handed her with a smile that hid my growing suspicion. I poured myself a glass of water, the cold liquid steadying my hands, and sat at the table where we'd shared so many meals. How many of those dinners had she sat through, lying to my face? How many times had she kissed me goodnight with his scent still on her skin? The questions gnawed at me, but I pushed them down. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford, not yet. I opened my laptop and transferred the photo. There they were, frozen in pixelated betrayal. Clara, her arms flung around him, and that man, his smug face, his easy confidence. I zoomed in, studying him. Dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, a jacket that looked expensive. Who was he? A coworker? A friend I'd never met? I didn't know his name, but I'd find out. I had tools, resources I'd never thought I'd need to use against my own wife. My job in data analysis gave me access to databases, search engines, tricks of the trade I'd honed over years. It was time to turn them inward. First, I checked her phone records. We shared a plan, convenient, now, that I could log in without her knowing. I scanned the numbers she'd texted over the past month. One stood out, a string of messages, daily, sometimes hourly, to a number I didn't recognize. My heart thudded, but my face stayed blank. I copied it, ran it through a reverse lookup. No name, just a carrier. A burner phone, maybe? Clever, but not clever enough. I cross-referenced the timestamps with her book club nights, her late shifts. They matched. Every single one. Next, her social media. Clara wasn't the type to post every detail of her life, but she tagged people, friends, co-workers, the occasional vague quote about happiness. I scrolled back months, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. Nothing obvious, no photos of him, no hints. She'd been careful. But then, a comment caught my eye, buried under a picture of her at a cafe last summer. Looking forward to next time. From a profile, James Carter. No photo, just an avatar of a mountain range. I clicked. Private account. Dead end. Or was it? I jotted down the name. James Carter. It was a start. The photo from today gnawed at me. I needed more. I grabbed my keys again, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name, and drove back to that house. The sun was dipping low now, casting long shadows across the street. His car, a sleek black thing, was still in the driveway, but hers was gone. She'd left already. Good. I parked farther down this time, pulled out binoculars I kept in the glove box from an old camping trip, and watched. The curtains were drawn, but a light flickered on upstairs. He was home. Alone? I didn't know. I didn't care. I just needed to see. Minutes stretched into an hour. My legs cramped, but I stayed put, eyes locked on that house. Then, the front door opened. Not him, her. Clara. She stepped out, adjusting her coat, her hair mussed like she'd rushed. My breath caught. She'd come back? Why? She glanced around. Nervous. Maybe. Then hurried to her car and drove off. I ducked as her headlights swept past, my pulse hammering. She hadn't seen me, but I'd seen her. Twice in one day. The lies piled higher. I waited until her taillights vanished, then turned my attention back to the house. He emerged moments later, locking the door, heading to his car. I followed. Reckless, maybe, but the coldness in me didn't care about risks. He drove to a bar downtown, a dimly lit place with a neon sign flickering open. I parked across the street, watching as he went inside. James Carter, if that was him, didn't look like a man hiding a secret. He looked comfortable, at ease. That made it worse. I could have gone in. Could have confronted him right there, watched his face twist when he realized I knew. But no, that was too quick, too cheap. I needed something bigger. I drove home, the plan taking shape like a sculpture emerging from stone. Clara thought she could play me for a fool. She thought she could have her life with me and her lies with him. She was wrong. Back at the house, I dug deeper. Her email, hacked years ago, password still the same because she never bothered to change it, yielded nothing obvious. No love letters, no smoking gun. But there was an email from last week, buried in her spam folder. Reservation confirmed. Crestwood Lodge. 2 nights. A weekend getaway. She told me she was visiting her sister that weekend. Another lie. I checked the date. 3 days from now. Perfect. The coldness sharpened into resolve. I wouldn't just expose her. I'd ruin her. Him too. I started drafting an email from her account. No, too traceable. A text from a burner phone of my own? Better. I'd order one tomorrow. The message would be simple. Meet me at Crestwood. Surprise. Send to him. Time just right? She'd show up, expecting her sister's quiet company. He'd show up, expecting her. And I'd be there, watching it all collapse. But that wasn't enough. I needed more, something to twist the knife. I remembered her prized garden, the roses she tended like children. She'd spent years on them, won awards at local fairs. I walked outside, the night air biting my skin, and stared at those perfect blooms. A cruel smile tugged at my lips. Salt water. A gallon of it, poured into the soil tomorrow night while she slept. They'd wither by morning, dead before she could save them. A small wound, but a start. I went back inside, the house still silent, and poured another glass of water. My reflection in the window caught my eye, hollow eyes, a face carved from stone. This wasn't me. Or maybe it was now. Clara had made me this way, and she'd reap what she'd sown. 3 days. 3 days until Crestwood. 3 days to tighten the noose. I sipped the water, the coldness spreading through me, and waited for the next move. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the sky pressing down like a lid on my simmering rage. I woke before Clara again, my body running on fumes and spite. She stirred as I slipped out of bed, mumbling something about coffee, but I didn't answer. Let her make her own today. I had work to do, quiet, invisible work that would build the trap she'd never see coming. The photo of her and him still burned in my mind, a constant prod to keep moving, keep planning. Revenge wasn't loud. It was a whisper, and I was learning to speak it fluently. Downstairs, I brewed my own coffee, the bitterness matching my mood. The house felt like a stage now, every room a set for the performance I'd orchestrate. Clara came down soon after, her hair tied back, her smile tentative, like she sensed something off but couldn't place it. You okay? She asked, pouring her coffee. I nodded, my face a mask. Just tired, I said, voice flat. She didn't push. Good. I needed her oblivious, drifting through her day while I pulled strings behind the curtain. Step 1. The burner phone. I left the house mid-morning, claiming a quick errand. Groceries, I think I said. She barely looked up from her book. The corner store 2 miles away sold prepaid phones, cheap and untraceable. I paid cash, kept my head down, and tucked the little black device into my jacket. On the way back, I stopped at a hardware store. A gallon jug of salt water wasn't hard to come by, pre-mixed for aquariums, but it'd do the trick for her roses. I bought it, along with a pair of gloves. No fingerprints, no mess. The clerk didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. Back home, Clara was out, another lunch with Sarah, no doubt. Perfect timing. I stashed the salt water in the garage, behind a box of old tools she never touched, and activated the burner phone. I typed his number from her records, my fingers steady despite the pulse hammering in my ears. Meet me at Crestwood Lodge this weekend. Surprise. Short, sweet, believable. I didn't send it yet, timing was everything, but I saved the draft, the words glowing like a promise. He'd bite. I knew he would. Next, the garden. I waited until dusk, when the neighborhood grew quiet and the shadows stretched long. Clara was upstairs, showering, her humming drifting faintly through the open window. I pulled on the gloves, grabbed the jug, and stepped outside. The roses stood proud in the fading light, reds and pinks she'd babied for years, their petals soft and mocking. I unscrewed the cap and poured, slow and deliberate, the salt water soaking into the soil. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, just a steady glug, glug, glug as I circled each bush. The gloves kept my hands clean, but my soul? That was already stained. By the time I finished, the ground glistened faintly under the moon. The roses wouldn't die tonight. They'd wilt tomorrow, slow and agonizing, a death she'd feel in her bones. I hid the empty jug in a trash bag, buried it deep in the bin outside. Evidence gone. I washed my hands twice, the cold water a ritual to steady me, then went back inside. Clara was in the kitchen now, chopping vegetables for dinner, oblivious. "Smells good," I said, forcing a smile. She grinned back, and for a moment, I almost faltered, almost remembered the woman I'd loved. Almost. Dinner was quiet. She talked about her day, some story about a coworker I didn't care to follow, and I nodded at the right moments, my mind elsewhere. Crestwood Lodge. 2 nights from now. I'd called earlier, pretending to be her, and confirmed the reservation. A secluded cabin, perfect for her so-called sister visit. Perfect for my plan, too. I'd drive up separately, stay out of sight, and watch it unfold. She'd arrive expecting peace. He'd arrive expecting her. And I'd be there, the ghost in the trees, turning their lies into ash. After dinner, I dug deeper into James Carter. The name nagged at me, too common, but I had a face now, a location. I cross-checked her contacts, her emails, anything I could access. Nothing definitive, but a LinkedIn profile popped up. James Carter, financial consultant, same city. The photo was grainy, but the jawline matched. Him. I smirked, cold and sharp. A money man. Fitting. Clara always loved the idea of stability. Ironic, considering she'd torched ours. I leaned back, staring at the screen. He had a life, clients, a polished bio, a smug little headshot. I could ruin that. A few anonymous tips to his firm, whispers of infidelity, unprofessional conduct. It wouldn't take much. People like him thrived on reputation, and I'd shred his. But not yet. That was the encore. First, Crestwood. First, her. The night deepened, and Clara went to bed early, claiming a headache. I stayed up, mapping the lodge on my laptop. Cabins spaced far apart, winding trails, a lake nearby. I'd need a vantage point, somewhere to watch without being seen. I found a spot, a ridge overlooking her cabin, accessible by a back road. I'd packed binoculars, a camera, maybe a thermos to keep me warm. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment tantrum. It was surgical. Before bed, I checked the roses one last time. Already, the leaves drooped faintly, the first sign of rot setting in. By morning, they'd be goners. I climbed into bed beside her, careful not to touch, and lay there, eyes open, listening to her breathe. She slept like nothing was wrong, like the world hadn't shifted under her feet. I envied that ignorance, hated it, too. Tomorrow, she'd wake to dead roses and a husband who smiled while plotting her downfall. Tomorrow, I'd send that text. Sleep came late, fitful, filled with flashes of her laugh, his face, the note crumpled in my fist. When I woke, the room was dim, Clara still asleep. I slipped out, checked the garden, wilted husks where her roses had been. Perfect. Downstairs, I grabbed the burner phone, opened the draft, and hit send. Meet me at Crestwood Lodge this weekend. Surprise. A ping confirmed it went through. No reply yet, but I didn't need one. The hook was set. Clara stumbled down soon after, yawning, and froze when she saw the garden through the window. What? My roses? Her voice cracked, eyes wide with panic. I stepped beside her, feigning shock. What happened? I asked, voice steady. She shook her head, rushing outside, hands hovering over the ruined blooms. They're dead, how? I shrugged, watching her crumble. Maybe a pest, I said, turning away to hide the flicker of satisfaction. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. The day stretched on, her mood sour, mine carefully neutral. She mourned her garden while I finalized details, packed a bag, checked the car, tested the camera. Tomorrow, Crestwood. Tomorrow, the trap would spring. I poured another coffee, the coldness in me a steady hum, and waited for the hours to crawl by. She'd built this cage with her lies. Now, I'd lock her in it. The road to Crestwood Lodge twisted through pine forests, the air thick with damp earth and silence. I left early, before Clara, before dawn, my excuse a fabricated work trip she didn't question. My bag sat in the trunk, binoculars, camera, a flashlight, the burner phone. The drive was a blur, my mind replaying her face as she'd mourned those roses. She'd cried, actually cried, over dead flowers, but not over us. That irony fueled me, kept my hands steady on the wheel. I arrived mid-morning, the lodge a scattering of cabins hugged by mist. Hers was number 7, tucked near the lake, a postcard scene she didn't deserve. I parked half a mile away, on the ridge I'd scouted, and hiked down through the trees. The cabin was empty still, she'd arrive soon. I found my spot, a cluster of rocks overlooking her porch, hidden by branches. Perfect. I sat up, the cold seeping through my jacket, and waited. Her car rolled in at noon, tires crunching gravel. She stepped out, alone, her face soft, expecting her sister. I snapped photos, the shutter a quiet click against the wind. She unpacked groceries, humming, oblivious. Then, another car, a black sedan. Him, James Carter. My breath hitched as he climbed out, grinning, carrying a duffel bag. She froze on the porch, her expression shifting, surprise, then panic. He called her name, striding forward. She shook her head, voice rising. "What are you doing here?" The text had worked. He thought it was her surprise. She thought it was a mistake. I watched, heart pounding, as they argued, her hands flailing, his face darkening. Unexpectedly, she slapped him. Hard. He staggered back, stunned, and I almost laughed. This was better than I'd planned. The chaos was mine to savor. Their voices carried, sharp, jagged, cutting through the stillness. "You shouldn't be here," Clara hissed, her fists clenched. James rubbed his cheek, eyes narrowing. "You texted me, said it was a surprise." She faltered, confusion creasing her brow. "I didn't." She stopped, glancing at her phone, then at him. I zoomed in with the camera, capturing every flinch, every lie unraveling. She didn't know about the burner. She didn't know it was me. He stepped closer, voice low. "What's going on, Clara? Is this some game?" She backed away, shaking her head. "No, someone's messing with us." "Us." The word stabbed me, but I stayed still, a statue in the shadows. Then, a twist, her phone rang. She answered, her face draining of color. "What?" "No, I'm fine." "Wait, who told you that?" She hung up, staring at James. "My sister. She got a message saying I was in trouble up here." My gut twisted. I hadn't sent that. Who had? The plan was fraying. Someone else was in the game. James grabbed her arm, insistent. "We need to leave. Now." She pulled free, eyes wild. "Not together. This is over." "Over?" I leaned forward, pulse racing. Was she ending it with him? Before I could process it, headlights flashed, a third car. A woman stepped out, blonde, furious. "James," she barked. His wife? My revenge had just summoned a new player. The blonde stormed toward them, her voice a whip crack. "You lying." She stopped, seeing Clara, and her eyes blazed. "Who's this?" James paled, stammering. "Lydia, wait, Lydia." His wife. I hadn't counted on her, but here she was, a grenade I hadn't thrown. Clara flinched, realization dawning. "You're married?" she whispered, stepping back. James reached for her, but Lydia shoved him, hard. "Don't touch her." I snapped photos, hands trembling, not from cold, but from the sheer madness unfolding. Lydia turned on Clara. "Did you know?" Clara shook her head, tears welling. "No, I swear." Lydia laughed, bitter and sharp. "He's good at secrets, isn't he?" James tried to speak, but Lydia cut him off, pulling out her phone. "I tracked your car, you idiot. Thought you were working late again." Clara bolted for her cabin, slamming the door. James followed, pounding on it, while Lydia yelled after him. Then, another twist. A man emerged from the trees, stocky, bearded, holding a rifle. "What's all this noise?" "A local, maybe the caretaker." James froze. Lydia spun, defiant. "Mind your business." The man didn't budge, eyeing them. "This is private property. Clear out." I ducked lower, mind racing. Lydia's arrival, the caretaker. My plan was spiraling, but the damage was done. Clara was cornered, James exposed. I hadn't expected this chaos, but it was beautiful, crueler than I'd dreamed. The caretaker's rifle gleamed faintly, a silent threat. I said leave, he growled. Lydia glared but backed off, dragging James to his car. He resisted, glancing at Clara's cabin, but Lydia's grip was iron. "We're done here," she snapped. Their sedan peeled out, gravel flying. Clara stayed inside, curtains drawn, a prisoner of her own making. The caretaker lingered, then trudged back into the woods. Silence fell, heavy and final. I waited, the ridge my perch, the camera my witness. Hours passed. Night swallowed the lodge, stars piercing the sky. Then, her door creaked open. Clara stepped out, face streaked with tears, bag in hand. She was leaving. Alone. I followed as she drove off, keeping my distance, headlights off on the back roads. She didn't go home. She stopped at a gas station, sat in her car, head in her hands. Broken. I could have ended it there, let her drown in her guilt. But no. The roses, the text, the chaos, it wasn't enough. I drove home, mind churning. By morning, she'd return, thinking it was over. It wasn't. I drafted an email from a fake account. Photos of her and James, sent to her boss, her friends, her sister. Anonymous. Devastating. I hit send at dawn, the coldness in me a steel blade. She walked in at noon, eyes red, voice small. We need to talk. I nodded, calm. About what? She hesitated, then confessed. Everything. James, the affair, the lodge. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I stared, unblinking. Okay. Just that. She blinked, confused. Okay. I stood, walked out. The email was already spreading. Days later, her world collapsed. Her boss called. Rumors of unprofessional conduct. Friends texted, shocked. Her sister stopped answering. Clara unraveled, pacing, pleading with me to understand. I ended it. I swear. I listened, face blank, offering nothing. The photos had done their work, her life in ruins, her lies exposed. James's firm fired him. Lydia filed for divorce. Collateral damage, but I didn't care. She moved out a week later, bags packed, eyes hollow. You've changed, she whispered. I shrugged. You changed me. She left, the door clicking shut. I stood in the empty house, the silence mine now. The roses stayed dead, the garden a graveyard. I'd won, cruelly, coldly, but the victory tasted like ash. Revenge had hollowed me out, left me a shell. Was it worth it? I didn't know. I didn't feel anything anymore.